My name is Joan Alexander. I'm a volunteer at the Everett Jewish Life Center. If you've been here before, welcome back. For first-timers, welcome. It's a mitzvah that you've arrived. We provide an opportunity to learn, debate, and laugh together. We explore Jewish music, politics, history, literature, comedy, and more. The Everett Jewish Life Center provides a safe haven for Jews and the Chautauqua community to examine issues of interest to the Jewish community. This is the center's 17th year. The physical space was built through a generous donation by Edith Everett and her family to memorialize her husband, Henry. Edith's goal was to create a Jewish community center with programs free of charge and 5 rooms for guests to rent. Her goal has been more than materialized. Programs include talks and movies. Program brochures are available in the lobby and on the porch, together with volunteer forms and suggestion forms. We welcome volunteers and suggestions. Our programming and operations are fully dependent on your donations. We don't get any money from the Chautauqua institution. Gate fees do not support us. Your tax-deductible gifts to the Everett Jewish Life Center help us to offer our programs and to expand our community. I invite you to join with me and donate to the center. You can donate online or using donation envelopes, also available in the lobby. This week's speaker is generously sponsored by Daniel, Helen, Benjamin, and Sarah Horwitz in memory of Dr. Leonard Katz. Leonard was the first program chair at the Everett Jewish Life Center. Judy Katz would like to say a few words, and then I'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joe. I have to thank my brother first, because he and Helen came up with this idea, and they haven't even been to Chautauqua in 30 years, so this was really, really nice. My dear late husband, and we were married 66 years, died in February. The first day we bought our house, Rich Moschel called and said, "Would you like to be on the Hebrew Congregation Board?" The next thing I know, my husband's president of the Hebrew Congregation Board. He started the Holocaust social justice program here. He also, where we send about 100 students from the Chautauqua, from this Jamestown, Chautauqua area to Washington, to the Holocaust Memorial and the Afro-American Museum. We also started a writing program. When the children come back, they have to write an essay, and then we give them a prize. And Joan mentioned what he did was do the first programming here with Norm Weinberg. So Dan and Helen, thank you again. Thank you.
It's my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Pamela Nadell. Professor Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University. Her book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 Everett Family Foundation Award from the National Jewish Book Council. It was named the Jewish Book of the Year. It was translated into Hebrew. I read it in English. I listened to the audio version, also in English. Both are excellent. Professor Nadell will be speaking here again tomorrow at lunchtime. Tomorrow's topic is her new book, which is entitled Anti-Semitism and American Tradition. It will be published in English in October 2025. To her chagrin, Dr. Nadell is probably best known for testifying before Congress, together with the 3 presidents, Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. You can see a picture of the 4 of them together. She is relieved that so far no one has called to fire her. I'm almost finished. Please silence your phones and electronic devices. Please deposit your garbage in the garbage cans on the porch. Please note that, as in the past, there is significant security at Chautauqua. It has many components, and much of it takes place behind the scenes. It's not visible. We all have a role to play. If you see something unusual, say something to one of the ushers or to anyone with an Everett Center name tag, like this. And now, finally, Dr. Pamela Nadell.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, this is on? Okay, all right, that sounds good. Thank you. So first of all, I apologize for not standing there. I get a little bit tired. I broke my arm. But I'm getting better, and you'll be able to see the slides, and that's actually the most important thing. And this was really to keep you guys away from me. So I'm gonna sit and talk. That's it. Right. And this is. Let's see. Do we have slides yet?
Yep.
Great. So this is, and that's just for tabs on the front. So this is a talk that I've actually given about 150 times, which is why my husband's not here. He's on the golf course because he already heard the talk. He doesn't want to have to hear it again. But he's going to come tomorrow so you can meet him because tomorrow's talk is actually brand new. It's about a book that's coming out in October, as you heard from Joan. I did bring some bookmarks about America's Jewish women. They're on the table. And I also brought postcards about anti-Semitism and American tradition, the new book that's coming out in October. So feel free to take them. I'm going to grab a clicker. Let's see.
Point it over this direction, yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So as you heard from Joan, that America's Jewish Women in History from Colonial Times to Today won the Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year Prize in 2019. And now I'm in the Everett Jewish Chautauqua Center, and it's really extraordinary, and it is really a deep disappointment to me that I have not had a chance to meet Edith Everett and to thank her for being such a staunch supporter of Jewish learning and learning about Jews and about Jewish history and culture, and I do hope that I will get a chance to meet her. I also very much want to thank Joan Alexander for hosting me. I want to thank Arlene Hoffman, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but I know is watching, for inviting me, Bobby and Joe Lewis for being such wonderful hosts, and all of you for coming today and for being so interested in spending so much time learning. So I'm going to do something that most history professors will not do. I'm going to show you some family photographs. Okay? So this one is my great-grandmother. And these photos, by the way, are on my dining room wall. When my grandmother was leaving her apartment, we found that these were printed on cloth and they were folded up in her sewing machine. My mother had never seen them, and I've actually been told that they're probably quite rare because they were printed on cloth, and so I have them put in behind museum glass, and extraordinary. But I'm pretty sure that this photo was taken in the first decade of the 20th century. My great-grandmother came from Russia. She, according to my mother, never really learned very much English. And then when I was on a book tour, I showed this to somebody who got a PhD in fashion. And she said to me, the dress my great-grandmother is wearing was made in the 1870s. This means she was wearing that dress for almost 40 years, which made her extremely old-fashioned. And this is her daughter, my grandmother. So this dress, again, it's amazing the things you can learn, right? This dress was called a linen or a lingerie dress. It was only in fashion from 1903 to 1910. And my grandmother is so I think she's about 13 here, 12 or 13 in this photo. And the great thing, I mean, those on Zoom, you can kind of zoom in and see it. She's got not only a bow in her hair, she's got bows on her shoes. I love this image. So this one is the woman with her back to us is my mother in a park in the early 1950s on a warm spring day. And she's wearing what she told me she always wore, a black pencil skirt. And if you look carefully over her shoulder, you see a baby's bonnet peeking out, right? That's me. So I didn't bring a photo of me because there's no reason to. You can see that I'm here. But I'm wearing what I have worn for my entire academic career, a black jacket, right? Okay? And this one is my daughter, and she's in a, dressed like a college kid, right? So she's in a short skirt. She's taking a selfie. I'm going to come back to that, okay? I'm really interested in technology, but I do need to tell you that she's also wearing tall boots, and for every woman in this room, you should know that they're mine. She took them. I haven't seen them again. I will never see them again. But you understand the experience, right? So what am I doing talking about skirts and dresses? And, what am I doing with this book? But the issue is that these are the images that took me into this story, right? My great-grandmother was of the immigrant generation. She came over, she didn't learn very much English, I don't really know what kind of work she did. My grandmother, her daughter, so she for her generation, she raised her kids in the Depression, and she worked as a bookkeeper. My mother was a secretary, then she had the kids of the baby boom, so she stayed home. And then when it was time to go back to work, she went back, by then it's probably called an administrative assistant, but eventually she became a real estate agent. My mother worked into her 80s. I rode the coattails of a revolution I did not make. And my daughter has clearly ridden those coattails because she's now a surgeon, and she never would have been able to become a surgeon were it not for that revolution. Wendy and I were talking about this before. So it's their stories, just like their clothes changed, their stories took me back, and I began to ask questions. How have their lives changed? What was different about their educations? What was different about the kinds of work that they were able to do? What was different about their politics? What about their games? I really want to know, when did Mahjong become a Jewish woman's game? I saw that it's at 1 o'clock this afternoon, so if anybody wants to rush out, I won't be offended. And what about technology? So my daughter was using a cell phone. Here's a slide of a woman. What is she doing? What is she doing? Laundry. She's doing laundry. It's the second decade of the 20th century, and she's doing laundry. This is clearly a posed photo. The kid is looking out at her, at the photographer sitting on the chair. That she's holding the baby. I'm really hoping she's not holding the baby, normally when she's doing laundry near boiling water. But she's really lucky because there are taps on the wall. She doesn't have to take the pump to a well to get it filled. She's got running water. She's living in the Lower East Side, the second decade of the 20th century. electric washing machines don't come in until the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. You need to understand how women's lives changed because of technological changes. So I had all sorts of questions in the book. I wanted to know, how did these changes affect their marriages, their childbearing, their child-rearing, the meals they cooked, they will come back to that later, the communities they built, whether they lived in colonial seaports or frontier towns or urban ghettos or post-war suburbs, the work they did, whether they were savvy businesswomen or they were rabbis. I wrote an earlier book about how they became rabbis, how women became rabbis, how they lived in times of war, how they lived in times of peace. But most of all, I wanted to know what it did mean to them to be Jewish women. And I end up seeing that Jewish women kind of fall, and I actually think Jewish men do too, into three buckets. So they're Jewish women for whom Judaism sits at the core of their lives. They go from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday, from family event to family event within Jewishness. They're Jewish women for whom being Jewish is very important, but it's more like Jewishness. They might not be moving from Sabbath to Sabbath, but more like from Hanukkah to Passover. And then there are Jewish women that I write about for whom being Jewish is not important at all, or so they think, until somebody brings it up. So this is how I think of it. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. So two women take us into my story. This one is Grace Mendes-Seiches Nathan. So unless you've read the book, have you ever heard of her? Probably not, right? Okay, so the first thing you should know about her is, so she lived in Philadelphia. Her father was a Sephardic Jew. Her mother was an Ashkenazic Jew. In the colonial world, that was an intermarriage, all right? Look at her dates. Look at what she lived through. The Revolution, the War of 1812. Like her story, we have her writings in the archives. Her story is that of a woman who was a daughter and a wife and a mother, and she doesn't write very much about the big political events that are going on around her life. What does she write about? So one of her letters is she's writing about a niece, and she says she's been spitting up blood for a couple of weeks, but the doctors are not so worried. They think her corsets are too tight. Clothing matters. This woman you will recognize, right? Do I have her name? There. Emma Lazarus? Yeah, Emma Lazarus. And what you don't know is that Emma Lazarus was Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter. And we heard yesterday, if you were at the, we're singing the song from Lazarus' The New Colossus, could be a retired before. So you know Emma Lazarus was extraordinarily famous. We're still singing and reading her poetry down until today. But Emma Lazarus had a completely different life than her great-grandmother. She never married, she never had children, she unfortunately died very young. I think she was 37 when she died. But what struck me as I was writing the book is that juxtaposing these two women made a lot of sense, not only because they were related, but because they were constrained by the realities of the roles fixed for women in their times. So both of them celebrated the fact that they were Americans. Both of them celebrated the fact that they were Jews. But then both of them also pushed back against the roles that women were supposed to play and actually ended up advancing Jewishness in America in some striking ways. So in one of Lazarus's poems, she wrote about her ancestors trudging out of Spain, coming to the New World. And she said that it's called In Exile. It was written in 1883. She said that they had the freedom to follow Moses' law and in this new country, quote, to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. So Spinoza, I see some recognition, right? Spinoza was an Amsterdam Jew. He created biblical criticism. He was expelled. He was kicked out, excommunicated out of the Jewish community. And good Jews didn't claim Spinoza in 1883 when she was writing. So she was claiming him in a very, very powerful way and pushing back against what other people would have said in that era. The amazing thing is Grace Nathan, colonial and early republic mother of the republic, did the same thing. She had one son that we know of, one surviving son. Maybe there were other pregnancies that didn't, or early children who died that we don't have a record of. But she told her son, and she wrote an ethical will at the end of her life. Have you heard of ethical wills? Okay, so she wrote an ethical will, and she said to him that at her death, he should only keep his beard for 7 days. Do you know? So a traditional Jewish man, seeing some nods, a traditional Jewish man will not shave for a minimum of 30 days following the death of a parent. She said to him, only wear your beard for 7 days. She was trying to change Jewish custom. And those are going to be powerful themes that will take us into this book. So I'm going to jump back. We're going to go back a half century before Grace Nathan was born. Only 35 years after the first Jews landed in New Amsterdam. And we're going to look at Abigail Levy Franks and her husband, Jacob. So Abigail wed Jacob when she was 16 and he was 8 years older. Now in some states, a marriage like that would be illegal because she would have been seen as too young. But in the colonial days, you had to marry somebody so much older because he had to be able to support the family. Needless to say, within the first year of marriage, she gave birth to the first of her 9 children. 2 of them died. That's not the record for a colonial Jewish woman. We think the record was held by Rebecca Machado Phillips. She had 21 children.
Oh my God.
And one of those children, by the way, was Uriah Phillips, Uriah Levy Phillips' mother, and her grave is actually at Monticello. If you go to Monticello, her grave is there. It's marked up. Anyway, the reason we know so much about Abigail is that her eldest son was sent to his uncle, his father's brother, and he went in London, and they lived together in London, and he married the daughter, and it's part of this kind of interconnected transcontinental family business. And she wrote him a treasure trove of letters that he saved. By the way, the first time they were published as the letters of the Franks family. By the next time they were published as the letters of Abigail Levy Franks, because she wrote all of them except for about 3 or 4. And in those letters, you hear this mother worried about her son. So one of the things she says is, her brother lived in England. She said, never eat anything at your uncle, my brother's house, except for bread and butter, because clearly she didn't trust him to keep kosher. And then the most amazing letter is she says, and I think there's a scene right there, and she says that she's so tired of the superstitions of Judaism that she wants and I'm quoting this, a Calvin or a Luther to rise amongst us, because she wanted to see Judaism reformed. Calvin and Luther, the great reformers, and then the Protestant Reformation, that actually is a direct line to Chautauqua. And kind of amazing to be here. But I also need to tell you that when her daughter Phila intermarried with Oliver Delancey, she wrote that she was so depressed that she never wanted to see or speak to anyone again. And we don't know if she ever reconciled with Phila. We have a letter from Jacob, her husband, trying to get them to reconcile. So we see the issue of intermarriage, a real intermarriage, not between a Sephardic and an Ashkenazic, but an intermarriage already is an issue in the colonial Jewish world. So I'm going to leave behind the American colonies of Abigail. I'm going to leave behind the early republic of Grace Nathan, and we're going to move beyond the untimely death of Emma Lazarus, and we're going to meet Rosa Sonnenschein. So this is another Jewish immigrant, wife, mother, who came to St. Louis from Central Europe in 1860 with her husband, who was the rabbi. So what did she do in St. Louis? She did the things that a good rabbi's wife should do. So she gave birth to the fourth of her 4 children. Note, family size is declining. It's going to be critical for what women can do. She did the things of a rabbi's wife, in terms of the synagogue. She wrote for the Jewish press, so we know quite a lot about her from that. And in 1879, she founded the Pioneers, which is the oldest Jewish women's book club in America. It's still meeting today. And I know you're very proud of the major book club that exists here as well. It's part of this when people didn't go to college, how do you continue to learn, right? And so that made her radical in one way. And then in the 1890s, she became radical in another way because she got divorced. The marriage had been really bad for a long time. She was waiting for the 4th child to grow up. And she divorced him. And even though he probably gave her grounds to do it, maybe she had grounds as well. But in the 1890s, you couldn't just get divorced, right? You had to have grounds. Like, if you've been watching The Gilded Age, you know that if you've been watching The Gilded Age. So now she's stuck. She's got to go out to work because he's not going to pay her any alimony. So she decided to found the first Jewish women's magazine in America, and it called it The American Jewess. One of the things that I really like about this is that we have a sense that the word Jewess was a negative term. Maybe some of you remember Gilda Radner's Jewess jeans. But Jewess was actually a term that Jews and Gentiles used to refer to Jewish women well down into the 1940s, maybe even a little bit into the 50s.
Yeah. Well, into the 60s and 70s in some places.
In some places, right. So this magazine is actually, it's been, the great thing about digitization, it's been digitized. And on the one hand, it featured Jewish women doing traditional things, but it all, mothers in Israel, but it also wrote about a woman named Ray Frank, who was a proto-rabbi in the 1890s. And also, Sonnenschein met Theodore Herzl and became a Zionist. And she wrote about that there as well. So what's going on in the 1890s? Let's think about this a little bit. These are the years of the powerhouse Jewish women's organizations beginning to appear. The first one in 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women. And they were massing to prove to the world that woman's sphere was the whole wide world. And that image on your right is an image of the women of the National Council of Jewish Women meeting at the White House because the cause that they took up was combating white slavery, which were international rings of prostitution. So we see them there. And the founder, of course, was Hannah Solomon. And one of the things I love about Hannah Solomon, besides the fact that she left a lot in writing so we can get the record, is that she, in her memoir, she talks about on Fridays shuttling between her desk and the kitchen where she's making her fish. Meanwhile, she founded a powerhouse Jewish women's organization that still exists today. And Hadassah, that, of course, you know as well, founded later in 1912 by Henrietta Zold, sent 2 nurses to Jerusalem. They hung out that sign. They saw 5,000 patients in the first year. But Jewish women didn't always need large organizations to be activists. So here we have Lillian Wald, the nurse who founded the Henry Street Settlement, who when the Spanish flu, plague, came to New York, she was put in charge of organizing the nurses' response for the entire city. And this photo, I actually got long after I published the book. It shows a woman named Sophia Lobinger, and she was a suffragist. And she is standing on a stepladder in a crowd of men in New York State trying to get them to vote, grant women the right to vote. And because remember, men had to give women the right to vote. And New York, of course, in 1917, as some of you know, became the first East Coast industrial state to permit women to vote. And that's really what paved the way for the 1920 Amendment. So the other thing is that it wasn't only middle-class Jewish women who organized. Poor Jewish women in the Lower East Side also organized. This is a photo of a later kosher meat boycott, but the first one was in 1902. And when the price of meat, kosher meat, soared from 6 cents a pound to 12 cents a pound on the Lower East Side, the women couldn't afford to feed their families. They needed every single penny to pay the rent and to buy food and clothing and shoes for growing children. And so they organized a major strike. Scott Seligman has written a terrific book about him, about the strike. But what was going on in the home? So I know I am with people who love to read. This is one of my all-time favorite books by Kate Simon. She was a travel writer. She was a professor at Hunter College. And she had a very interesting and difficult life. And she wrote this memoir. It's the first of 3 volumes called Bronx Primitive. And in it, she tells a story about her mother. So on the eve of the Sabbath, every Sabbath eve, her mother would polish the furniture with lemon oil, and she would make gefilte fish. And then the Sabbath would come, she would light the Shabbos candles, she'd begin to bless them, and one Sabbath, she pulled off her headcloth, blew out the candles, stopped in the middle of prayer, and said, "No more, never again. I don't have to do this, my mother's not here." And Kate Simon said her mother never lit Sabbath candles again, but the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish on Sabbath eves. And it's an important story. It links us back to Grace Nathan, to how Jewish women intervened in shaping Jewish life in America. So one more from a little bit later, well, about at the same time as Simon was writing. Remember who Edna Ferber was? That name ring a bell? Okay, so she wrote Giant, she wrote Showboat, she was incredibly well known. So in the early 1930s, she's had a soiree that's sort of, like some Michigan industrialist has invited a bunch of people to stay at his home in the woods, and they have to take a train to get out there, and they can't get back until the morning, and they're all staying over, and they're having dinner together. And she watched as the host started talking about money-grubbing Jews taking over the world. And everyone around the table started to respond. And she turned to them and she said, "I'm a Jew." And she said they looked at her with such hatred that when she went to her room that night, she not only locked the door, she put a chair against it. And it's stories like that about Jewish women responding to anti-Semitism that actually led me to the new book. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's an important story for today. So I'm going to skip over World War II. I don't skip it in the book, but I'm going to skip over it now because of time. I want to talk about the 1950s because as we were talking before about how activism in the 1950s complicates our understanding of the Leave It to Beaver era, shall we say? So I'm going to give you some headlines, okay? Bronx Girl 21 wins Miss America. Who? Bess Myers. Okay, so we got Bess Myers. All right, next one. That one's easy. This one's hard. Boxing fan wins $64,000 decision. Boxing fan wins $64,000 decision. Who is it?
Oh, no.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? So Dr. Joyce Brothers, and this is so great because it's the early 50s. First of all, she's so unusual. She got a PhD in psychology, right? Secondly, she's married to a physician. He's in training. He's a resident. He's not making much money. They need money, but they have a kid. She wants to stay home and raise the kid. And so he says to her, or she says, they come up with the idea together. It's not clear which. I always thought I should write about her, actually, but her archives are voluminous, so this is for Daniel. But, yeah. So maybe I'll do it one day. So he says you should memorize a boxing manual or boxing encyclopedia and go on one of those newfangled TV shows called the $64,000 Question. She wins $128,000. Needless to say, from there she goes on and she makes a major career as a psychologist on television and radio. And it's those archives that are kind of what's putting me off. Okay, Case of the Teenage Doll. Barbie, come on guys. You all know that, right? Okay. It used to be that nobody knew it when I would say it, but we all saw the Barbie movie. All right. So the inventor of Barbie. So the next one is not a headline, but it's a song title. So there was a song called "Will You Love Me Tomorrow," right? Right. Okay. And who wrote it? Carole King. Okay. So here's Carole King and Jerry Goffin on their wedding day. Right? Why are they getting married?
She's pregnant.
She's pregnant, exactly. She's pregnant. So what are the choices in the 50s? You get an illegal abortion that could either kill you or send the doctor who's doing the abortion could send that person to jail. Or you could go away to a home, have the baby and give it up. And there was a Jewish home where women went away that was actually run by the National Council of Jewish Women. Or you married the father and had the baby, or as somebody once said to me, or somebody else was willing to marry you. So, I didn't put this in for Daniel, but it's always been there. And then, of course, 63, Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. So what do these women have in common? The only thing they have in common is that they're all Jews, and all of them had their names in the headlines. And it means that this era that we think of as this photo, so these are the mothers of the baby boomers. This, by the way, is actually in the now it's called the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. So it's the mothers of the baby boomers pushing the baby carriages into the future, and it's those children who would make the revolution, whose coattails I rode. But those mothers were also making that revolution because, let's be honest, women who are pushing baby carriages have a lot of time to think, right? So what it says is, we think that's what the 50s looked like for Jewish women, but I just showed you a whole bunch that it didn't look like for them, and then there's more. So this is Luba Bott. Luba Bott was a survivor of the Holocaust. Her uncle was Sidney Hillman, who was actually a major labor figure, and he worked on labor under FDR during World War II, and she was a nurse in Warsaw. She survived the ghetto. She survived being captured by the Gestapo and being beaten. She survived Auschwitz because she was sent as a Polish political prisoner she never fessed up during the beatings that she was actually a Jew. So she came to America. 2 weeks after she's in America, one of her aunts said to her, "Tell me everything that happened now, and then never, ever speak of it again." No, that's that era when we have the perception that those stories were not being told. We do know that they were being told, but I don't know if she ever spoke of it again, but she wrote 2 volumes of unpublished memoirs, and they were left in the archives of Yad Vashem for me to find. What else is going on in the 50s? Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, right? Their execution, their trial, sent a Cold War chill across the left movement among American Jews. And what else is going on? Jerry Thayer left her husband and her kids and went to hang out in the subterranean lesbian clubs in Greenwich Village. So the 50s are far more interesting than we think. Now they gave way to the 60s, right? So now I'm going to come back to technology. Do you remember these? I grew up eating them. They were great, right? My parents could go out. So there are all these technological changes, but yeah, TV dinners, I don't know how much they changed the lives of American women, but the pills sure did. So that family size that had dropped from 21 or 9 in the colonial period down to, by the time we get to Rosa Sunshine, 4, and even lower by the time we get to the 20th century, that's what enabled women to burst out in so many different directions and be involved in all of those organizations, because they spent far less of their lives pregnant, raising children, nursing them, and they had all of this quote-unquote leisure time, especially for the middle class. So these are what the 60s look like. You have a sense of, all of the major changes, Mao Zedong, the landing on the moon, so many things that were happening. But what's happening in terms of the women's movement? And that's this image here. What we know is Betty Friedan was one among many, many Jewish women who were leading the way in the women's movement. In fact, do I have Women's History Month? Yeah. So Women's History Month was called for by a historian named Gerda Lerner, who had escaped, Who had escaped Vienna after the Anschluss, after the Nazis had taken over Vienna, and she and her mother were horrifically imprisoned there. They actually managed to get visas to come to the United States. Her mother felt she could not make it all the way to America, so her mother stayed in France. Lerner never saw her mother again. Lerner came to America. She was involved in writing, and in her 40s got a PhD in history at Columbia University, where she wrote about two sisters in the South who were abolitionists. And when she went out on the job market, one of her professors said to her, "You shouldn't really tell people about this peculiar specialty that you have." But she became a pioneer, really the pioneer of women's history writing in the United States and beyond. And she, in the 70s, called upon the government of the country, where she became a citizen, to create a Women's History Week. We now have Women's History Month. It didn't get abolished this year, I don't think. I think it did. I think it actually, yes, I think it continued. So that's what's happening, and there's so many Jewish women's names that I could tell you tons and tons of stories. I've written elsewhere about it. So, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, what was the difference between a bookkeeper and a Supreme Court justice? 1 generation. Because of the revolution that came. So how did it impact Judaism and the Jewish community? So this is what the Jewish community used to look like, right? What's going on here? Who knows? Yeah, it's the confirmation class. Maybe the Hebrew congregation here doesn't have it, but established synagogues across America have these images, but not everyone has the one from the Eastwood Jewish Center. So look to the woman who is sitting to your left, right? The left of the rabbi, right?
Yeah.
You know who it is? It's Ruth Bader. It's Ruth Bader. It's Ruth Bader Ginsburg at her confirmation, not at her confirmation hearings. Okay? I could tell you a story about how that center lost that photo, and I'm looking everywhere for it for the book. But anyway, and this is what women in Judaism look like today in some sectors, and this is women, Reform Judaism, and Jewish women were calling for ordination back in even before the 60s. So huge change. So just to take you back to the book cover. Okay, so look at how much we did in really a little bit more than a half an hour. We went from the colonial period all the way up to the 21st century. We looked at this enormous sweep of change in terms of family size, work. I didn't really talk much about politics or where people lived, but I certainly could do that. We met so many different women. We met Abigail Levy Franks and Grace Nathan, and looked at Emma Lazarus a little bit more deeply. We looked at Jewish women's organizations. I mean, it's an enormous topic. We also looked at, just briefly, a woman encountering anti-Semitism, which is what led me in part to my next book that's coming out later in the fall. So I'm going to close with a pair of letter writers, okay? Do you remember when the Soviet Union refused to let our people go? There were these twinning ceremonies, these B'nai Mitzvah twinning ceremonies. Remember at the Bima, there would be a chair for a Soviet youth who couldn't have a bar mitzvah. Okay, so in 1982, a ninth grader from Miami Beach, North Miami Beach, who liked, by the way, to collect stationery, wrote a Soviet twin, and she asked, did the letters that she sent, and the stationery she sent, had they ever gotten there? So the Soviet twin, so I'd seen that letter from the archive. The Soviet twin, I had her name was Kira Volkovsky. So I did what a good historian does today. I went on Facebook looking for Kira Volkovsky. So I found her in Jerusalem. She had gotten out, and I interviewed her. I wrote her and I said, did you ever get that letter? Did you get those letters that your American twin had sent? And she said to me, by the way, she's a web designer, she said she has no memory. It turns out the Soviet twins had lots of American twins, like 15 or 20. So it wasn't just a one-on-one. She said she was friends with one of the others, but she didn't remember this one. So I said, okay, and I said, you know, it was a shame because your Soviet twin was a woman named Sheryl Sandberg. Sheryl Sandberg, former COO of Facebook. So I said, well, are you by any chance Facebook friends? She said, no, but her father and Sandberg's mother were. And Sandberg's parents were very, very active in the Soviet movement. And there's a wonderful, wonderful new book. It actually just won the American Jewish Studies National Jewish Book Award Prize this past year about American Jews and the movement to free Soviet Jews by Shaul Kellner. So I think it's a great place to end because I swept through over 350 years of American Jewish history, and I'm going to end with another pair of letter writers, and somebody down the road is going to take that story further. So I'm open for your questions.
One more question, and take the microphone and speak directly into it so people outside and downstairs can hear you.
Well, thank you to all the Yiddish mamas. You mentioned early ordination of rabbis, women rabbis, but I thought the Reform movement only ordained 50 years ago. Were there earlier ones than that?
So So I wrote a book a long time ago called Women Who Would Be Rabbis, about the struggle for women's ordination. Ray Frank in the 1890s functioned as what I would call a proto-rabbi. She was never formally ordained, but she was called the girl rabbi of the Golden West. She's part of a history that begins, it's a parallel to the movement for women to become doctors, to become lawyers. It's part of a parallel of that movement that gets launched in the late 19th century alongside the women's suffrage movement and then continues through. But you are right, the first woman ordained in the United States in 1972 was Sally Poisson in the Reform movement. But there was a woman ordained in Germany in 1935. Her name was Regina Jonas, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. But she functioned as a rabbi.
Thank you very much for your talk. First, a comment for you. Some years ago, I got new neighbors, and as we got to know each other, the woman who is my neighbor wanted to do something nice for me, and she got me a copy of your book.
Oh, that's so sweet. That's so nice.
And I thought she had me down pat. It was a wonderful gift. I teach cultural anthropology at Rutgers Camden, and it overlaps with gender and women's studies. And of course today, gender studies is imbued with a lot of anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism. And I'm just wondering, is that where you're going to pick up the story for the next book?
So great question. Well, especially I graduated Douglas, which was the Women's College of Rutgers University, and I don't think I'm going to write another book about women. I was originally going to write specifically about women and anti-Semitism for the new book, and then my agent and my editor said, no, I should just write like a big history of American anti-Semitism. So I'm not sure I'm going to write on gender again, but I have a personal experience with that kind of dismissal of Jewish women from women's and gender studies. So at my university, I chaired the history department for 5 years, and they needed somebody to chair what they call the Critical Race Gender Culture Studies Collaborative, and Women's and Gender Sexuality Studies program was part of that. And that was the year that I published America's Jewish Women. Got no recognition for publishing that book from those colleagues, and it was because I worked on Jewish women. So I know about the National Women's Studies Association. The anti-Semitism in that organization goes back to a conference they held at Ohio State when I was still a graduate student in the 80s, and it's been a long-standing problem within that discipline, as it has within a number of other of these studies disciplines. But that's a really good question.
Thank you for your extraordinary talk. I have a question.
Sure.
How about bat mitzvahs? When did they first start? Because I have to tell you, I was bat mitzvah in 1949 in a conservative synagogue.
Wow.
Awesome. So,
Yeah,
Reconstruction. All right, well, that would explain it. So the first bat mitzvah in the United States was Mordecai Kaplan at the Society for Advancement of Judaism, which was, Mordecai Kaplan was a faculty member at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is conservative. At that point, the Reconstructionist movement was a wing of the conservative movement, and he held the first bat mitzvah for his daughter Judith. You should know that the night before the bat mitzvah, his mother and his mother-in-law both turned to each other and said, "Can't you stop this?" When someone won't listen to me, and he wasn't going to listen to the other one either. And so the first bat mitzvah in the Reconstructionist movement is in 1922. It spreads very, very slowly. Yeah. Among Reconstructionist Jews, among rabbis who were affiliated with Kaplan, and then ultimately, also as a byproduct of the women's movement, it takes off, right? And so the beginnings of it, did you have a Saturday morning bat mitzvah? Or Friday night?
Oh boy, good question.
Because what you can see is, like in these efforts to be more egalitarian, yeah, you would see bat mitzvah classes, doing something on Friday night, and eventually it spreads to the Orthodox. But they'll have there'll be a Kabbalah Shabbat, or it'll be after the Sabbath, and it might be a group, or it might be an individual, and so it spreads. There are records of bat mitzvah even earlier. I edited a book with Jonathan Sarna years ago called Women in American Judaism, and I think that book has an article about sort of the dissemination of bat mitzvah.
I would like to
You were a
remind people.
pioneer.
I would like to remind people that Dr. Nadell is going to do a book signing right over here as soon as the question and answer is over. Does anybody else have another question?
Oh, well, I think you'll get the mic next.
Yes. My question has to do with looking ahead. With intermarriage increasing drastically, how do you view the future of Jewish women?
So what's so interesting about the changing stance of the American Jewish community around the issue of intermarriage? So today, the majority of liberal Jews marry out of the Jewish community. And there was, the angst within the American Jewish community was very much around the fact that those who married out would be completely lost to the Jewish people. And we know from the work of the scholar Karen McKinty that actually that wasn't true even earlier, and definitely is not true in the 21st century. So that one way of looking at this is that in terms of numbers, it's actually a net gain for the Jewish community. But the studies that the Pew Research Center does of Jewish identity shows that Jewish identity, the measures that they use, are stronger when it's two Jews who marry, rather than a Jew and somebody who's not Jewish. So, so there are just different ways of looking at it for the future. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I pause.
You paused? Okay. Others?
I guess we can set you over
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
care, Joan.